Hello, hello. Welcome to the Henry George program. I'm Mark Molyneux, and I'm joined by co-host Jacob Schwartz-Lucas, representing EarthSharing.org and the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation. This is a program dedicated to finding practical answers to the housing crisis here in the Bay Area and beyond, economic volatility, poverty, and environmental degradation. More specifically, we compare and contrast the ideas of the 19th century economist Henry George with that of both historical and contemporary thinkers. We address issues ranging from artificial intelligence, automation, and universal basic income to city planning and the land value tax, a concept popularized by George. This week, we welcome Corey Smith of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition, SFHAC, whose goal is to sharply increase the rate of housing production from 1,500, what we have currently, to 5,000 new homes per year. Welcome, Corey.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing pretty okay. And hello, Jake.
Hey.
Hey. So it is an exciting way in some places that we're getting more and more YIMBY activity. People saying, yes, please build here. SFHAC. What is the differentiator? How do we keep them all sorted out between this and everyone else trying to fix the housing here in the Bay Area?
It's funny. So we do joint happy hours with all of the YIMBYs once a month. And I asked one time Laura Clark, one of their co-executive directors, what's the difference between our organizations? And she goes, well, we're the punk rock organization in the pro-housing world. And so, I think message is pretty consistent. And I really think, honestly, a lot of where we differentiate is tone and tactics. But at the end of the day, more housing is better than less housing. And what the YIMBYs have been able to do has truthfully been a tone setter in a very positive way, not only in San Francisco, but around the entire Bay Area.
So do you, outside of tone, do you actually find yourself disagreeing on much?
Occasionally. Oftentimes, though, to be honest, it's a little bit more about the politics as opposed to the policy, just because we operate in different spaces in the San Francisco and Bay Area political world. So, we have nuanced differences and we talk about those and we address those. But, by and large, we realize we're on the same team and we work together, whenever possible.
Yeah. So, what was the first time you realized that the housing here in San Francisco is not working, not normal?
Oh, I took a abnormal path to all of this. I spent a few years coaching basketball, then I spent some years in tech, and I actually wanted to come in from the political aspect and had no urban planning background, but I got involved in a campaign and came across the organization and just started to learn about housing in the Bay Area. Like many others, I was originally inspired by Kim Cutler's Burrowing Owls article. And once you start kind of diving into some basic facts about it and just the simple, how many jobs have come to the Bay Area since the turn of the century versus how many homes we've built. From our perspective, and I imagine the three of us, it shouldn't seem like rocket science. But, there's other interests and those other interests often are very valid. But, we disagree.
Yeah, on SFHAC, one of the things that it proclaims, who gets to live in San Francisco? SFHAC says anyone who wants to, and that is, some would say that's just common sense. You shouldn't have anything which privileges other people over existing folks or people who have the money to do it. Mm-hmm. But it is controversial. A lot of people do feel that SF is for SF. There's this pretty, there's a kind of grotesque group called that. It's SF for SFers.
Yeah.
And how do you just say that it's right to make SF for everybody?
Well, I think it's just a personal philosophy, and I always approach this either from, I think we take a very macro view of it, and we look at this from a big picture problem. Overpopulation is something I think about a lot. Climate challenge is something I think about a lot. Livability, commute times, all of this stuff is a big deal to me. And so that puts me on the side of, if we have to change the physical structure of a city, let's make sure we get the appropriate transportation infrastructure and improved operations in place. Then everything's a go. But the other side to that argument is, and this is completely justified. It's just a more micro view that, life is short and we don't need to be overly concerned with what's going to happen a couple of generations from now. We should be enjoying our lives in this amazing city. And when you create a bunch of traffic and a bunch of construction, and when you're changing theoretically what makes this city great, that view isn't wrong. I disagree with it, but I think it's important to understand where those folks are coming from, and acknowledge it. Just say, we disagree, and we're going to try to out-organize you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess they are saying there are advantages of lower density versus higher density, but they come with the secondary thing of saying, and who gets to enjoy the lower density? We do, which is it's a political answer. I mean, I certainly respect. You go back to the Marion Headlands; they were going to densify it, and I think it's a great thing that we have a lot of nature preserves. I think it's great that we do preserve the wilderness, but the people in the Marion County certainly believe that, well, keep it low density, but we have God's given right to be here, and that's something I definitely feel is kind of begging the question, and it's always good to I guess shake that up.
This whole idea of overpopulation, it's valid when you think about the theoretical limits of the planet and living within our ecological means. But even the idea of overpopulation is kind of a manufactured, self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you think things are overpopulated, you don't want to create infill, and that means that people are just squeezed all the more, and then you can point to this self-fulfilling prophecy, which you're not calling a self-fulfilling prophecy, and say, look, we're overpopulated. We can't accommodate more people. Go away.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of scary how overpopulation is out there. SFHAC displays its lesson of the Bay Area housing crisis and what can be done with Bay Area Housing 101. It's a 25-minute presentation that you guys put on. We don't have 25 minutes, but what is the ultra short version of what's going on in the Bay Area?
Well, I think the first thing that's really key is we reframe the entire conversation and don't use the word crisis. The Bay Area is experiencing a housing shortage, and we're experiencing an affordability and displacement crisis. But, simply speaking, if we had built the homes that we needed to for the last 30 or 40 years, we'd be in a significantly better situation today. So the other thing that we really like to associate with that is crisis invokes this notion that we don't know what's going on, we don't know what to do, and we don't know how to fix it. That's not true. We're perfectly aware of the solutions. We just have to create the political will to get it done. So the point of the presentation that we take around to, companies and neighborhood associations and quite literally anywhere, we try to touch on why it's important for different individuals. Is it a socioeconomic issue? Cultural diversity? Is it environmental? Is it just simply the rent is too damn high? We frame the problem. We explain how we got there, and it's 30 to 40 years of bad decisions that we made. This wasn't like somebody waved their magic wand, and then we present the solutions, and we make it very clear that if you want, and if we, and I mean the royal we, want to fix this, people got to get involved, and you have to be engaged politically, and that's really kind of the big takeaway that we want people to have is. This is fixable, but, you got to do something. Get off the sidelines.
And how well does this message get over when you put on this presentation?
Positive. And what's interesting, it's positive not only for kind of the stereotypical millennial tech person, but I go into neighborhood associations where everybody is over 50, everybody is a homeowner. And when I explain the difficulties of getting something done from a development standpoint in San Francisco, I just ask the question, how many of you have ever had to go to the planning department to get a permit for something? And sure enough, there's at least a half dozen. And then I ask those people, was it cheap? And everybody shakes their head no. And I say, was it fast? And everybody shakes their head no. And I go, okay, well, imagine that on a $100 million deal. we're talking a $25,000 deck. There are people's careers and food on the table for their families at stake with this stuff. So even that, they get that, and being able to talk in a way to the audience that they understand and they relate. We're not going to get every person, but we don't need every person. We just need, a significant majority to be voting the right way.
So the policy proposals of SFHAC are saying that 5,000 units a year would, unlike now, allow San Francisco to keep up with the current growth of population. Does this also account for the backlog, or is this basically write that off and we'll just make it work going forward?
So the 5,000 a year number is so housing prices increase at the exact same rate as inflation. That's not an opinion. That's a mathematical formula that's been put together. The city's chief economist said that. I'm actually organizing a panel at Spur around how many units do we need? How many units do we actually need to build? And it's all based on your desired outcome. It's not a right or wrong answer, but we've just kind of circled it as, okay, here's the target, here's why, and that's not necessarily even up for debate by economists and people that understand how this stuff works. Somebody will debate it, but somebody will always debate everything.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can set aside, talking about the assumptions going into a model. In San Francisco, you get people who just don't really acknowledge that supply and demand is a real thing. How often do you deal with people who tend to be real skeptics of the idea that housing supply matters?
I make a very strong point in my life to not argue with the idiots. There are people that want to focus on the demand side. We need to decrease the amount of jobs that we're bringing to the region. We wholeheartedly acknowledge that would work. That is a way to tackle this problem. It's just not the route that we want to take. And for the people that aren't quite sure, we in our Bay Area Housing 101 show data that is decently digestible for the average person. And they go, okay. One of the famous places that this came from was a housing activist in San Francisco named Calvin Welch, who has a history of protecting actually my neighborhood, the Haight-Ashbury. And he has this long discussion where he talks about supply and demand and goes through it and yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, he confuses causation with correlation and doesn't look at the macro environment and understand how the Bay Area housing market actually plays into this. It's not just the San Francisco housing market. And so most people get that, and the ones that don't, you just kind of got to go, okay, and move on.
Yeah, so I guess the people who do argue that, if you build more housing, kind of like it's the argument against highways. If you widen highways, you'll just get more cars on the road. If you build more housing, there'll just be more people moving to San Francisco to fill it up. What's the best way to counter that?
What's the alternative? There are hundreds of thousands of people that commute from the Central Valley every single day to the Bay Area core for work. We have to, again, thinking from a macro perspective, take the best real world solution that exists. One of the key things I think we also need to do is acknowledge that, because I get this a lot, well, all the new housing is only going to be for wealthy people. That's true. The reason we don't have middle income housing in the Bay Area is because we didn't build market rate housing in the 70s and 80s. I am a believer in filtering. I followed the data on that. And so acknowledging this isn't a short-term fix. I mean, this is something that we are way behind. So 5,000 units per year, every year for the next 20 years to get into an improved situation. But it takes time. Absolutely.
So I guess one ugly side of political feasibility is what is politically feasible to build. It usually isn't building where perhaps they should be. You never build in the rich folks' neighborhoods. It tends to be built in where people have less political power to counter it. Yep. And that's what gentrification is. It's filtering, and eventually it will get housing to people, but it certainly puts the screws on people who lack the political power today. What is the right answer for how we make sure people aren't just screwed over with this?
So again, following facts, and I think pro-housing folks actually, we get a little too wonky sometimes. We don't make the emotional arguments, which are oftentimes more politically powerful. But we know that building more market rate housing in a neighborhood decreases low income displacement. That's a fact. The other thing I think that's really critical is differentiating displacement from gentrification, because they're very, very different. Displacement is people getting kicked out of their homes and being forced to leave an area. Gentrification is a changing neighborhood, and gentrification can actually be positive in a lot of ways. Safer neighborhoods. When you have a street that is gentrified, maybe that means there's more streetlights at night and people can walk up and down the street safely because there's more going on, more people. That is gentrification, but I would argue that's a positive thing. The negative impact for gentrification is displacement. It's where people do get priced out, and it's a very difficult balance in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So I guess the current solutions for affordability, which is the people who tend to say, "Oh, don't try to build market rate housing to make things affordable. We have a solution for it." It tends to be heavy impact fees, and then also having a certain rate of below market housing for each unit, and so on. What's your general impression of how well these are working today in actually giving the affordable housing that people demand?
So in San Francisco, there was a project on Indiana Street in Potrero Hill, and there were 17 below market rate units that 1,700 people applied for. There's a popular home builder in San Francisco that just describes it as a lottery for low income people. And if you're lucky enough to get it, great. I'm a firm supporter of inclusionary housing, because I do think we need to be finding things in the short term to be able to help people. My organization helped write the original inclusionary legislation in San Francisco with, at the time, Supervisor Mark Leno. But we would also argue that, and there's a debate in San Francisco right now, whether it's going to be 25% or 18% below market rate. We would argue that 25 or 18 of 1,500 isn't the argument. We need to figure out how to get to 5,000, increasing the total number of below market rate units to help more people. At the end of the day, it's got to be about people. So the more people we can help, the better off. And then that's that balance between short-term, great, we're creating a lot of low and middle income housing that's subsidized, while in the long term preparing future generations for the challenges that they're going to have to deal with by adding lots and lots of supply.
So I'm not sure about all the details up in the city. In the backyard here at Stanford, Palo Alto, subsidized low-income housing is now people with up to $250,000 a year qualifies low income here in Palo Alto, which is just shows you how absurd the situation is. How does that work up in the city? When we talk about who gets to live in subsidized affordable housing, housing for who, most people don't actually get that. It's math that determines that. So in the city of San Francisco, it's, kind of the similar way. So we're debating legislation right now that would subsidize housing for individuals making up to 140% of area median income. For one person, that's $113,000 in San Francisco. For a family of four, that's $161,000. It's a lot of money, certainly. But, when you hear about a significant majority of San Franciscans and really folks around the Bay Area paying 50, 60, 70% of their income on rent, it's a broken system in so many ways. And so it's, we're so far behind. That's really the challenge. And, we got to do what we can step by step to dig our way out. Yeah, so you've talked about the bad decisions we made over decades and decades. Just go more into, what are the worst decisions we've made as a whole?
Well, it's the famous phrase, unintended consequences. When we did these things, there was a point at the time. And oftentimes, actually, that point was really valid. But, as we get further away, it's gotten to be really difficult. I think the two most, well-known and popular that we always talk about are the famous Prop 13 and the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. Prop 13, locking property taxes in, creates a bias towards office and commercial space. And then obviously CEQA, which, a good environmental law that was intended to protect the environment, has become a tool for folks to delay, obstruct, outright stop housing. And so we need to make sure that in both of these cases that we, have intelligent reform, thoughtful reform that helps people. And things are always going to be different. The regulatory climate's always going to be different. The economic environment's always going to be different. And they're just simply outdated. So whatever we can do to kind of, tweak here and there will be better off.
So CEQA, my impression is CEQA is, if you say, should we build more housing here, CEQA will say, no, it's going to be bad for the environment. If you say, should people commute from Tracy into town, CEQA says, I have no opinion on that. Sure.
Right.
Is that a fair impression of that's what CEQA is telling us?
The range of how CEQA has started to be abused is really starting to get ridiculous. In San Francisco, there was an example of mixed income development projects going into the Mission District, which is, the hot rod area for development because of gentrification and displacement. I mean, because it's happened so much there. And people are now claiming in legal CEQA appeals, that gentrification, that changing the physical structure of a city is environmental, and therefore we shouldn't be building new housing per CEQA. That's not environmental. Under the merits of the California Environmental Quality Act, gentrification is not written in there. Gentrification is a big deal. We need to talk about it. We need to address it, but it's not a CEQA issue.
And in general, I mean, it's established that single-family suburban-style housing has a far greater environmental impact than more dense living, townhouses, duplexes, apartment buildings. But does CEQA not have anything to say you should be building less single-family housing or preserving less of it?
No. I mean, CEQA was signed by Governor Ronald Reagan, and it's largely unchanged since. It's just not, I mean, in the simplest of ways, it's out of date. It wasn't written when we had a concept of climate change. It wasn't written when we were thinking about, goodness, we better not keep building these highways and have all these cars going all around because that's really hurting our planet. And so that's where the reform has to come in, and the unintended consequences are obvious to some, but there's a large incentive to not fix it.
So short-term, long-term, what is SFHAC trying to do to reform CEQA?
So I think the number one thing that we need to do is simply making sure people are aware of what's going on, and then little simple tweaks. So there was a study done by a law firm in San Francisco called Holland and Knight, and they found between 1997 and 2014 that almost 60% of CEQA lawsuits were on infill projects. So middle of the city, downtown, development projects. And the environmental impact for those projects is very different than the environmental impact of plowing a bunch of trees in the Marin Headlands to build a bunch of stuff. So I think that's really one of the key things. We need to make sure people are educated about what's going on. We need to re-examine how we look at infill housing, how we look at the environmental impacts related to infill housing, and also understanding the consequences. If we don't build here, where are we going to build instead? The other one, and this just drives me crazy personally, you can file a CEQA lawsuit anonymously. You don't ever need to put your name behind anything. If you're unhappy about something, okay, but stand up. Be an adult about it. Don't hide behind an attorney because you're unhappy that something's going in your neighborhood.
Do the NIMBY crowd, do they acknowledge and are they trying to push for CEQA reform too, or are they pretty happy with the status quo?
By my understanding, they're very happy with the status quo. The view from the ivory tower is very nice.
Yeah, and they certainly will call themselves environmentalists. So, talk about Prop 13. In my mind, yeah, I mean, Prop 13 is it. I mean, Prop 13 is where things really started going wrong, and I guess is SFHAC, do they have an official position on Prop 13?
Yeah, I don't know if we've ever actually taken an official position. I think we, again, operating in the realities of the world, you're not going to get folks to raise their personal property taxes. And again, the law was put into place, not a whole lot of long-term thinking, but with the intention of helping people. And that's why they did it. But I think looking at commercial and office reform, both to, number one, increase the total amount of revenue that the state can generate is really, really key. I mean, I think we're at an all-time high, if I'm not mistaken, of state revenue generated by personal income taxes. And so figuring out a way to reform on the commercial and office side, Evolve is one of the great organizations out there that's trying to do that. And then that will in turn, start to lessen the bias that Prop 13 creates around building office and commercial over housing.
Yeah, so I guess if you ask like the mistakes we made with zoning over the years, I guess the second question is why do we make those mistakes? If it was such a bonehead decision, why did we make those mistakes, and what's going to stop us from making those mistakes in the future?
I mean, I don't necessarily think they were viewed as mistakes at the time. The gentleman that I referenced earlier, Calvin Welch, I mean, he came to political power because the city of San Francisco bulldozed Fillmore and an African-American community. And when they showed up, they said, hey, we're going to build you a bunch of new housing and you'll be able to move back. And then they didn't. They just said, whoops, sorry. And then they turned to the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood and said, hey, you're next. And the neighbor said, whoa, no, you're not going to do that. If that's all the story Calvin sounds like a hero. I mean, he protected the neighborhood. He protected residents. He protected people. And that's a good thing. So, so much of the problem is we're trying to avoid the unintended consequences, but, inherently about them, we don't know necessarily what they are. So we're just trying to be as thoughtful as we can, thinking both short term of, okay, where zoning tweaks can we make? Transit corridors, upzone transit corridors. What are the potential unintended consequences? We talk through all of those, and we try to make the best decision possible. Is it going to be perfect? No, definitely not. But short-term and long-term thinking at the same time and trying to gather as much facts as you can, you really just try to do the best you can.
So I guess, an extreme case to be made is maybe we shouldn't be building demand until we figure out the overall long-term land use policies, or else we don't have a long-term solution. Until we reform, repeal, do whatever we need to do to Prop 13, maybe until we get that foundational fix going, just building more supply won't be enough. What would your response be to something like that?
Every home you don't build in San Francisco for a Bay Area employee is going to be built out in the Central Valley. We talked about overpopulation as a problem. We've been plowing over some of the most productive farmland in the history of the world to build single-family tract homes. You got to look at, okay, if A happens, then what? So I don't think you can do that. I think you have to do all the Prop 13 stuff, try to fix it, and at the same time adding housing. And again, the best thing about this is, number one, we're putting market rate units onto the market, which is good. And we're also putting a lot of subsidized affordable housing units on the market, which is also very good. So It's not an either or. It's and then some. It's all of it. It's not always easy, and we don't know that we're going to be right every single time, but it's the best option that we have.
I guess where maybe we disagree is I think the real end goal is we want people to upzone their neighborhoods and really have the rational desire to want to do it. And I don't see until we really address the way the land is taxed, and which means Prop 13, mm-hmm. I don't think people will ever want to upzone their community.
Which that's ludicrous in my opinion, because upzoned communities means you have more people, which means you have better neighborhood serving retail, which means you have more things happening in your neighborhood that is positive. Now, this is assuming you like cities. I live in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, and the Haight-Ashbury commercial corridor sucks. It's T-shirts and bong shops, and it's single story. And what I would do to put 6 stories all up and down Haight Street, to revitalize the neighborhood, to make it more walkable. I think, again, I do think you need to do all of that stuff and all the other stuff.
I guess you say you want to live in cities. We have the weird case in the Bay Area. We have real cities in downtown San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, and then we have the suburbs, which are becoming as expensive, more expensive than the cities. What's the general relation between SFHAC and the way that it treats its peninsula, suburbs, and beyond? So
for the longest time, we had not taken a position on anything outside of San Francisco. But really last year, the increasingly obvious fact that this was a regional issue said, okay, we have to think regionally about this. So we're doing it a few different ways. Number one, there's a project in the city of Brisbane, California, which is directly south of San Francisco city limits, that has a 684-acre piece of land. It was a former rail yard with a train station right in the middle. There's a development proposal there where 95% of the housing units would be within a half mile of the train station that is currently operational. So that's kind of one. So we find smart regional impact projects. And then the other side to it, and I think this is the key in terms of actually fixing this, it doesn't actually happen in the Bay Area, in my opinion. It happens in Sacramento. It happens with state legislation. Senator Scott Wiener's SB 35, Assemblymember David Chu's AB 73, finding ways that would incentivize or in some cases punish those peninsula cities for not building their fair share is how we fix this. So it's moving away from local control more towards state control, because ultimately the state of California has a desire to fix it from a macro perspective where individual municipalities don't necessarily want to change.
Yeah, so SB 35 just 2 weeks ago passed its second round of committees, as I understand, and mm-hmm. it's moving ahead. What's your overall impression of, is this thing going to make it?
I wish I could give a more positive answer, to be honest with you. I don't know. I really don't know. It has passed through 2 different committees, the Senate Transportation and Housing Committee, the Senate Governance, I think is how you say it, and Finance Committee. But, there's a lot of strong interests in Sacramento that don't want this to pass. We were very involved from the very beginning. We have a very good relationship with Senator Wiener. We have about 160 business members that build housing around the Bay Area that were involved in helping draft the legislation and providing input on what was realistic. But I don't know. We're doing what we can, but it is a uphill battle for a state that has strong local government power in Sacramento.
Different areas, different toolboxes. The city council I interact with the most is the Palo Alto City Council, which mm-hmm. which KZSU Stanford brings us to the air every Monday evening. So you say that most people would want to upzone because it makes their place a better place to live. Palo Alto residents do not want to upzone. They absolutely do not want to upzone. They feel it is only going to make their lives worse, and they have no incentive to change things. Without the incentive to do stuff, do you think without completely removing local control, there's any way to make a situation better where people just don't want to upzone?
See, I think that this goes back to where I imagine the three of us, we like to talk in terms of facts and in terms of policy and in terms of, this wonky dialogue. We don't talk about the people, we don't talk about how we don't create that incentive for Palo Alto residents. Most people value, economic, social, and cultural diversity. The Bay Area as a whole is becoming increasingly white. And one of the things that I was chatting with a fellow activist recently about when he talks to neighbors that are typically against upzoning, he goes, if we don't add additional housing, there's going to be somebody that is making $250,000 a year that's going to compete over a housing unit with somebody that's been living here, their entire lives, maybe a minority person of color making $80,000 a year. Who do you think is going to win? And when you paint it in a more personal light, and when you talk about the people, folks do understand, and I think you actually can move some people over. And then the other part to it is, while they're, Palo Alto, as you folks obviously know, had a, I think, pretty positive election from a city council perspective last November. And I think there is an increasing appetite to do it. And I think that when organized the right way and when sending the right message, people actually can get behind the concept. But there's a large amount of skepticism towards what it's like, and the evil developer and all this stuff. They're home builders. They're people that provide shelter for people. And changing the dialogue, changing the messaging, I think can get people on board.
I guess there's, a cultural shift is one thing you need, but you also need people who are able to make the calls. And in Palo Alto, they did have a positive election last year from a YIMBY's perspective. They
Thank you, by the way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say, we have a person who ran on a completely pro-growth, pro-development, increased housing platform, Adrian Fine, is now part of the council. But, I mean, I've been following week by week. They were just barely able to get past a slightly increased over the state-mandated minimum of the granny unit zoning increase, and there was just plenty of outrage, and there are virulent NIMBYs on the board who felt this was a schizophrenic increase in zoning. And I kind of feel like the YIMBYs in the council, they are still fighting for scraps in something that is never really going to make Palo Alto remotely affordable at this rate. I just tend to kind of be doom and gloom that in a place where the economic incentives are so much stronger than the will to make hard decisions, the hard decisions will never be made. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know. I don't know what to cure myself of this skepticism that the only thing that will make it better are big, dramatic changes like Prop 13 reform.
Well, I think, so economic, incentives, those exist, yes. Flip it the other way a little bit. Ask the person that is economically benefited by not building housing if they have children, and ask them where their children live, and ask them if they have any grandkids and whether or not they're able to see their grandkids, and talk about climate change and whether or not they think that's a problem, and ask them about the number of people that drive every single day from the Central Valley to the Bay Area. So while the economic incentives exist, it's important for the YIMBYs to find those other incentives that actually do get people to go, oh, yeah, I guess that does make sense. And then you talk about the positive impacts of development, neighborhood serving businesses, walkable communities, again, people having shelter. Then all of a sudden you personalize the argument to flip it back. And the other thing I think that's kind of critical to this, we're behind the eight ball simply because we're younger and just arriving on the scene, and our voting blocks have not been established in the great numbers that they will be in the future. Homeowners vote at a higher rate than renters. So a lot of it is really just kind of playing catch up with the demographics and, again, voting blocks that are strong enough and powerful enough to flip elections.
One thing that I wanted to, if it's okay if I jump in for a sec, I wanted to state is that with regards to inequality and power that's gained from inequitable policies, that can be used to, stop measures like the one you're talking about, and basically allowing zoning to be controlled at the state level as opposed to the local level. And even if you can get all of the zoning increased in your neighborhood in Haight-Ashbury, it's still, it's a good thing. I'm not criticizing it, but it still doesn't solve the sort of inequitable distribution of the increase in the value of the real estate, specifically the land, in the area. So you could upzone the Haight-Ashbury area, and you could have 6-story buildings and turn it into something like Paris, which has a very comfortable density, and you just have a lot more units on the market. But it's still going to be those people who own land in that area who are going to benefit. And so, when you talk about the inequity of it, I still think you're faced with that basic problem, even though we might have a lot more people able to move to the Bay Area, and there could be some reduction in displacement.
Yeah, agreed. I think one of the things that we always really try to hammer, though, is while there are a lot of challenges, and we deal with land value in a very scarce city in San Francisco, there are other things that bring benefit to people, and I try to be big term thinking in a lot of ways. But if we were to upzone the Haight, if we were to get 6 stories across the board and have a increased number of both affordable housing units and total units, the benefit exists for all of those residents. And yeah, land values are still going to be off the charts, and we're not going to be generating the revenue that we need to off of this very valuable land, but people get to live there, and that is the value.
So I guess, one thing that would, make or break the ability to sustainably grow in a city is the ability to fund the infrastructure of where you build. And that's something that a lot of NIMBYs will point at, saying, you can build here, but who's going to pay for the additional schools, the additional streets, the additional, sewer lines, whatever? And they would say, we just don't have the taxes to pay for it. A person like Jake and I who say that, well, increased land taxes, they solve this issue. You get a virtuous cycle of the more you build, the higher the land values grow because of the increased density, and that actually will fund itself in a way. And without that solution, what is the solution for how do we pay for the extra infrastructure?
Private development certainly does some of it, and we referenced impact fees earlier. I'm a big fan of community benefit districts and finding additional ways to tax new development in neighborhoods as well that would turn around and pay for transportation infrastructures. It does go back in a lot of ways, though. It's not even a white elephant in the room, but everybody's talking about it. Prop 13. I believe in 2015, the city of San Francisco, if we had had normal property taxes, we would have generated an extra $580 million. $580 million in 1 year for the city. That's a lot of money. And yeah, we can build a lot of train tracks with that.
If you're taxing the new development, it's sort of like you're putting the brakes on the very thing that you want more of, right? If you want more development, why would you decide to go ahead and tax that development? It seems to be sending mixed signals to the market with impact fees.
Yeah, it's a short-term and long-term benefits and trying to balance the two. But you're absolutely right, because increased fees and taxes 100%, decrease the amount of housing units built. So it's that tricky balance between fixing the big picture problem and at the same time going, hey, it'd be great if we had a couple extra buses running up and down the street. How are we going to pay for that?
So 15 years ago, if you said that Prop 13's days are numbered, it would sound insane. It would sound, of course, it's going to be around forever. But I feel that just now there are more people just saying, well, Prop 13 is the problem, we all agree, and Prop 13 is unsustainable, we agree, and the demographics are pushing towards an entire, class of people who just are, just see no benefit. Do you see its days just have to be numbered?
I think you're going to have a very difficult time convincing people to increase their own individual property taxes on residential properties. I certainly think they're probably more numbered from a commercial and residential perspective, but the people that are benefiting financially from lower property taxes are the people that vote in higher rates. And, Prop 13 reform, and I'm sure you two know this, only happens when 2/3 of California voters decide to do something. So that's a lot of political will that needs to be generated. And, as our generation gets older and we see this problem, perhaps, but I don't think it's coming in the next 5-10 years. I think we're looking, 20, 30, 40 years down the line before we actually have a reversal.
Yeah, well, I guess the overall trend is California now has, I believe, the lowest rate of homeownership in the United States. It's having the exact opposite effect of making, homeownership possible for people. And it's only going to get worse. I mean, because, there's just even the people who are well off can't afford a home. And if the majority of people become renters, why do we support a subsidy for people who are lucky enough to have land subsidized for them?
Yeah, definitely that. And as demographic gets older, if that's the case, I think that'll be one of the things that flips it. We're not benefiting from this. We're not making money. In fact, we're being held out of the market and our schools aren't getting the revenue. Let's do something about it. I'm mad as hell, as they would say.
Yeah, so I feel like, not to be too antagonistic, I feel like the tyranny of small differences, it's just kind of funny how it comes up. We want all the same things. We want affordable housing. We want just basically, this area to be affordable for everybody, no matter who you are. But I guess, would you say the main difference is of kind of long-term versus, short-term feasibility? And I definitely feel maybe we need a mix of folks who are getting out and just making sure things happen in the short term. But is there a usefulness for them, for people who have more of an eye in the long term? Or do you think the long term is not so important as far as how we look at things?
I think it definitely has to be a balance between the two. One of the things that I say often, for example, that I would like as a long-term goal for SFHAC, and I think for the YIMBY movement generally, is 20 years from now, putting a ballot measure on in the 9 counties that would put the entire region under one transportation agency. What I think that would do is that would allow us to, number one, get improved transportation around the region, which is obviously very, very critical. And then number two, it would give us the financial incentives, the carrots and the sticks for, increased infill development along those transit corridors. So suburban cities, we could say, because we have one transit agency, if you don't build the housing, you don't get the transportation infrastructure improvements, and have that be the incentive to do things the right way. So we have to be thinking long-term, 100%, but we can't ignore, what we have in front of us at the same time. And that balance is difficult, and people need to be working at both at the same time, and being very upfront and open and transparent and, thoughtful and factual in what they're advocating for, what their priorities are. And if you do that, then the solutions make a lot of sense.
So I guess here's a question about the limitations of empathy. It's very easy to be empathetic for the person in front of you. The message of SFHAC being anyone who wants to get into San Francisco can live here. That's the dream. This hypothetical person who should be able to live here but currently is elsewhere, yeah, this hypothetical person who should be able to live here but currently isn't here, it's very easy to ignore them and say, yeah, not my problem. I don't have to have them in mind. It's very easy to pretend they just don't exist. They're not flesh and blood in front of me. How do we increase empathy for these hypothetical people out there?
So I think the wonky argument is 84% of people that move into new development in San Francisco move into that housing from San Francisco. So the significant majority of people that live in new housing in San Francisco already lived in San Francisco. And then the other part to it is, for most folks, the easiest thing I think to draw to is, do you have kids? Where do your kids live? Is it affordable for them? Is it affordable for your grandchildren? Do you care about your grandchildren? Do you care about teachers living in our community? Because that's middle income housing. Do you care about working people living in our community? That's middle income housing. And being personal with it and not talking about 84% of new development has San Franciscans moving in, yada, yada. I think that's how you get people on board. And again, we don't need everybody. We just need a voting bloc large enough to win.
I guess the real pessimistic scenario is when we have an economic system, which is basically the landlordism we see in the Bay Area and beyond, that penalizes empathy and really rewards a lack of empathy, we start to self-select for the people without empathy. And we self-select for having the crabbiest, most disheartening people. You get the people who don't mind if their kids have a place to live. They can charge them rent. You get people who just, and I that worries me. It worries me that if we have to go uphill against our own economic system to make empathy work for us, it will peter out at some point. And I just always, I don't know if that's really a question. It's more of the kind of worrisome in my mind that we're becoming meaner all the time, and I see that every day.
I have another pessimistic thought, and that is that maybe we're in some kind of game theory equilibrium state where young people become old enough at some point and get enough money to actually buy property themselves, and then even if when they were young they were the defenders of newcomers and having equitable policies, that they are seduced and they become so pessimistic themselves about changing the system that then they just become the new landlords, and then the young people come along again and say, oh, well, we should do things more equitably, but by that time it's too late to get the old timers on board. I'd love to get your guys' reaction to that.
Well, it's the old, my daddy beat me, so I'm going to beat my son too. Yeah.
One of my kind of favorite, and obviously we're talking maybe YIMBYs and NIMBYs, but it's the conservative before 40, no heart, liberal after 40, no brain type of idea. I think that's something that is a very realistic challenge that we're going to have. We have a phrase, I got mine, go F yourself. And that's something that we will have to deal with, and have to keep ourselves in check as we, for the lucky some of us that become future homeowners one day, going, there's this financial incentive, but there's all this other stuff that makes it worth adding more housing here. Focusing on the positives, and I'm an optimistic person, so that's easier perhaps for me, and messaging it from a personal perspective, I think, is really critical to avoid, Jacob, exactly what you're describing.
Yeah. So, Corey, I don't know where else you've lived. I'm just kind of curious how you compare being in the SF. You're an East Bay native, is that correct?
Yeah, Oakland.
Yeah. I guess being from elsewhere, I just feel that people have become meaner here. And I don't know, have you seen that in your being over here in the course of your lifetime, that there is more desperation and meanness in people than there were when there was more to go around?
I think that is, I think it surfaces more. Just because it kind of what catches headlines. I distinctly remember, I don't know if it was a 60 Minutes interview or maybe a CBS interview with President number 45, right when he took office. And he has this kind of sadistic, the world is an awful place and everything is bad and yada, yada, yada. And I'm just like, poverty is at an all-time low. There are more people as a percentage with access to drinking water today than in the history of the world. The world is the best it's ever been today. It is the best we have ever had it for the human species. Now, there's a lot of challenges, absolutely. But I just don't – I think that we become polarized. I think media does a lot to that. But as somebody, I go to a lot of neighborhood meetings and talk to a lot of different people, and there are those people that exist, but the significant majority, I think, of people are pretty happy, and it's because, especially in the Bay Area, we've got a nice kind of cush lifestyle, and maybe, that's a subject to my echo chamber and who I interact with, but, I disagree with that. I think that people are maybe not as vocal as they need to be about the positive things, but I think we're in a better situation now than we ever have been.
I guess, really big picture, that tends to be kind of the argument of like, is capitalism failing? Does capitalism need to be replaced? And folks would say, no, look how high the quality of life has been, which I think a person who tends to have read Henry George and kind of seen some things there tends to see as a false choice between yes, capitalism, no capitalism, as opposed to you could theoretically keep what works about it and then change other things, such as the ownership of natural resources. And I guess a person who's a curious thing is Henry George's ideas have been largely forgotten, but they actually have become kind of resonating in the common sense of how we build cities. They're really the only economic system that naturally spurs itself towards building cities. Everything else tends to have them just they can't exist. I don't know if Jake, if that seems something you've seen.
Absolutely. I just wanted to make a comment about how mean people are. When I go to the Bay Area and I live in New York, I feel like the culture is much friendlier. When you get in a train in New York City, and I guess the displacement crisis is, as Corey phrases it, isn't as bad here as it is in the Bay Area, but it's pretty bad here. And when you get in the subway, people are very aggressive with each other, and they jostle and they'll actually. I've seen just last week I watched a train go by and two people were punching each other in the face, and I was just shocked that and I think it has something to do with just how packed everyone feels. So I feel like the Bay Area culturally is just, maybe it has to do with being more progressive and the legacy of the hippies, but it's paradoxical at the same time that, when I walk in downtown San Francisco, I see a lot more people just sleeping out on the streets, needles in their arms, and I just thought that was a sort of tangential but interesting point to make, that the economic situation seems to be worse in San Francisco, but yet people feel nicer to me from an outsider perspective.
Yeah, I guess I grew up in a suburb of Cincinnati, and I feel people generally are very neighborly there, and they tend to feel like we're all in this together in a way that I don't see here. And I don't think they're better people there. I just think they just don't see the surplus of demand there. And I guess is that really? It seems like a really bad outcome. If you want your community to be good, just hope and pray that people never want to live there. And I guess, is that the blueprint for how we make things work? Because it sounds like that is kind of the idea. It's we don't have a solution for, if you have extra demand, break in case of emergency and do this, and we don't have that now, or it's not politically feasible, that is.
I've always been a big fan of Bobby Kennedy, and so I think two things. Number one, one of my favorite quotes from him is that 20% of the people are going to be against everything all the time. Even talking about two people punching themselves or punching each other on the subway. Well, yeah, that becomes what people notice. But how many trains went by where everybody was just commuting? I mean, from a total number perspective, I'm a huge believer in utility theory. And so when I look at this stuff even from a micro or macro perspective, it's just, how can we help the greatest number of people possible, knowing that, haters going to hate. That's just the reality of it. And you're going to have fringe people. But, the significant majority of people that ride the train every day are just riding the train to get to wherever they need to be. And it's probably my worldview more than anything else. But, most people are doing pretty well. So, it's just, again, the best we can do given the circumstances.
What I'm saying is just anecdotal. And I mean, I think that maybe the difference is that the trains are just actually a lot wider in San Francisco than in New York and less rickety. And, I'd be curious to see what the numbers actually are. But, it does seem to me that people are just kind of angrier and more aggressive here.
There was a door that fell off of an SF Muni train recently. So maybe we're having that pack problem as well. A door literally fell off while the train was driving. It was like, whoa, okay, let's.
Someone was leaning on it, or
it
just fell off randomly?
They say don't lean on the doors. Do not lean on the doors. They're not kidding.
Well, that's a good public service message for the people out there. Don't lean on the doors. Yikes.
Yeah.
So I guess we've gotten kind of ranty on this end, but yeah, I mean, what's something to be excited about? SFHAC and trying to make housing better in the coming months. What's something that makes you excited about what you're doing?
So I think kind of in the short term, we've got a couple of different pieces of legislation in San Francisco that hopefully we're going to pass in the next couple of weeks. One would upzone commercial and transit corridors all over the city. More affordable housing, more total housing, more density. We think that that's a really good thing. And we're also resetting the inclusionary requirements. We're going to lower it after last year. We put it way too high where it was economically infeasible, so we can actually get things built. The other side to it, speaking from a big picture perspective, I talk with people that have been in the city for 20, 30 years, and what the YIMBYs have been able to capture, and this, as millennials move into the working force, there is a more pro-housing attitude in the Bay Area that has ever existed, or at least within the last few generations. And so, while we can be frustrated that it's not going as fast as we would like, people that have been here a long time tell me constantly, we're going in the right direction for the first time in a really long time. And so remembering that this takes time, we have to be patient, we have to be willing to work. We're going to have to delay the gratification a little bit, but we're going to win. I mean, we will fix this. This isn't something that is up in the air or we're not sure how it's going to work. And we will fix it. And I take a lot of confidence in who I see and who I talk to and who I interact with. I see it every day. And that makes me incredibly optimistic.
So, yeah, this is we've been in conversation with Corey Smith of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. And yeah, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
I really appreciate you guys having me and fighting the good fight. Everybody that's listening to this, stay informed, stay educated, organize, and for the love of God, please vote.
Yeah, we're all in this together. Well, thanks so much.